"Ma'am, step away from the vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them." The command cracked across the crowded parking lot with the weight of unquestioned authority, drawing every nearby glance toward the woman standing beside a dark blue SUV. Naomi Carter slowly lifted her eyes from the reusable grocery bag hanging at her side, her expression calm despite the sudden silence settling over the late Saturday afternoon. The summer heat shimmered above the asphalt outside the neighborhood shopping center in Charlotte, North Carolina. Shopping carts rattled across faded concrete. Children laughed near the ice cream stand. Somewhere in the distance, a country song drifted from an open pickup truck. Then everything seemed to pause. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped forward with measured confidence, one hand resting near his duty belt, his polished badge catching the bright sunlight. Years in uniform had taught him exactly how to command attention, and attention was exactly what he wanted. People slowed their pace. Conversations faded into whispers. Phones quietly appeared in curious hands. Naomi blinked once before speaking in the same steady voice she used every day with frightened children and overwhelmed families. "Officer, is something wrong?" Brooks ignored the question. His sharp blue eyes traveled from the SUV to Naomi and back again, as though the answer had already been decided before he arrived. "Is this your vehicle?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Registration?" Naomi reached carefully toward her purse, moving slowly enough that every motion could be seen. "I'm going to get my wallet." "Don't move too fast," Brooks interrupted. "I'll tell you when you can reach for it." A nervous murmur rippled through the growing crowd. An elderly couple stopped beside their shopping cart. Two teenagers exchanged uncertain looks before quietly starting a video on one of their phones. Naomi lowered her hand again without argument. She understood something many people never did. Sometimes dignity meant refusing to let someone else choose your emotions. She stood beneath the blazing afternoon sun wearing simple jeans, comfortable walking shoes, and a pale green blouse with a small, embroidered sunflower near the collar. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance except the quiet confidence she carried wherever she went. Earlier that afternoon, she had spent 3 hours helping arrange emergency housing for a young family displaced by an apartment fire. In the passenger seat of her SUV rested a worn teddy bear belonging to a little boy who had finally smiled for the first time in days. She had promised herself she would return it tomorrow after having the torn seam repaired. Brooks took another slow step closer. "We received a report about a suspicious vehicle matching this description." Naomi nodded politely. "I understand. I'm happy to cooperate." Her answer almost seemed to disappoint him. He had expected fear, perhaps anger, maybe even an argument. Instead, he found someone whose composure refused to feed his certainty. Around them, more shoppers gathered naturally, pretending to organize bags or check receipts while quietly watching the encounter unfold. The parking lot suddenly felt much smaller than before. A gentle breeze lifted loose strands of Naomi's dark curls across her shoulder. She tucked them behind one ear without breaking eye contact. "Officer," she said softly, "may I ask why you believe my vehicle is connected to the report?" Brooks folded his arms. "I'm asking the questions." The words landed heavily in the still air. Naomi inhaled slowly. Years of counseling children through impossible moments had taught her that calm could spread just as quickly as panic if someone chose it first. She looked briefly toward the small group watching from several yards away. Their faces reflected uncertainty more than judgment. Nobody knew how this moment would end. Then Naomi returned her attention to Brooks and spoke with remarkable gentleness. "Officer, for everyone's protection, would you please make sure your body camera stays on?" For the first time since approaching her, Daniel Brooks hesitated. It lasted less than a second, almost too quick to notice, but several people did. His jaw tightened ever so slightly before he answered with a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "Don't worry about my equipment," he replied. "You should be worried about explaining yourself." Above them, white clouds drifted lazily across a brilliant Carolina sky, completely unaware that dozens of ordinary lives had just become witnesses to the first moments of a story no one standing in that parking lot would ever forget. Naomi Carter did not lower her eyes because she had spent too many years teaching frightened children that dignity was often the only thing no one could take away unless you surrendered it yourself. She remained exactly where she was, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing slow and steady, while the warm Carolina breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery across the parking lot. Inside her reusable shopping bag were ordinary things that reflected an ordinary Saturday afternoon. A loaf of whole wheat bread, fresh fruit, a carton of milk, peanut butter, and several boxes of crayons purchased with her own money for children whose families could barely afford rent. None of the people quietly watching knew that only 2 hours earlier she had been sitting on the floor of a community shelter helping a little girl color pictures of butterflies because the child had not spoken a single word since losing her home in an apartment fire. Naomi believed healing almost always began with small moments that nobody else noticed. She had learned that lesson from her grandmother many years before. Growing up in a modest neighborhood outside Charlotte, Naomi was taught that kindness was never weakness and patience was never surrender. Her grandmother used to tell her that storms eventually passed, but the choices people made during those storms stayed with them forever. Those words had followed Naomi into adulthood, through college, through long nights studying social work, and through countless difficult conversations with families who had forgotten what hope sounded like. Every weekday, she walked into places where people carried invisible burdens heavier than anything money could solve. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered birthdays, favorite colors, and the names of beloved pets, because she knew those details reminded hurting people that they still mattered. The teddy bear, resting quietly in the passenger seat, was not simply another forgotten toy. Its name was Captain Buttons, according to the 6-year-old boy who hugged it every night before sleeping. Earlier that morning, one of its seams had finally split open after years of being loved, and Naomi had promised to repair it herself before returning it the following afternoon. She never broke promises to children. Across from her, Officer Daniel Brooks shifted his weight slightly, watching every movement with growing impatience. He had encountered angry drivers, nervous teenagers, argumentative shoppers, and impatient business executives. But this woman unsettled him for reasons he could not explain. She was not challenging his authority. She was not refusing his instructions. Instead, she answered each question with quiet respect that somehow made the entire exchange feel increasingly uncomfortable for everyone watching. A young father standing beside his pickup truck glanced toward his wife, who quietly squeezed his hand without saying a word. An elderly veteran adjusted the brim of his baseball cap and continued observing from several yards away. 2 grocery store employees paused near the automatic doors, pretending to organize shopping carts while stealing concerned glances toward the growing crowd. More phones slowly appeared, held low enough to avoid drawing attention, but high enough to preserve every passing second. Naomi noticed them without reacting. Her focus never drifted far from the officer standing before her. Experience had taught her that fear often spread faster than truth, but truth had a remarkable habit of enduring long after fear disappeared. She folded her hands gently in front of her, making every movement slow enough that no reasonable person could misunderstand her intentions. The afternoon sunlight reflected softly across the windshield of her sport utility vehicle, illuminating the colorful drawings taped inside the rear passenger window. They were thank you pictures from children at the community center, simple stick figures surrounded by smiling suns and oversized hearts. One drawing read, "Miss Naomi helps everybody," written in careful letters that leaned unevenly across the page. Daniel Brooks briefly glanced toward the colorful papers before looking away again as though they were irrelevant. Naomi quietly wondered whether he had ever noticed how much people revealed about themselves simply by choosing what they ignored. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang the half-hour, its familiar tone floating gently across the shopping center. Life continued all around them. Cars entered and exited the parking lot. Families carried groceries toward their vehicles. Birds circled above the light poles searching for crumbs. Yet inside the widening circle of silent witnesses, time itself seemed to slow, waiting for the next decision either of them would make. Officer Daniel Brooks had worn the badge for nearly 18 years, and somewhere along the way he had stopped seeing it as a responsibility and started treating it like permission. Around the precinct, he was known for being confident, decisive, and impossible to challenge. Younger officers often copied the way he carried himself, believing experience automatically meant wisdom. Few of them knew how many quiet complaints had followed his name through the years. Most never became formal investigations. Some witnesses decided the process was too exhausting. Others convinced themselves that nothing would change even if they spoke up. Each unanswered complaint quietly strengthened Brooks's belief that he could trust his own assumptions more than anyone else's words. He had become comfortable deciding who deserved patience before a conversation even began. On that bright Saturday afternoon, he looked at Naomi Carter and believed he already understood her story without asking a single meaningful question. To him, she was another person who needed to explain herself. He never considered that she might simply be a neighbor returning home after serving her community all morning. He never noticed the stack of neatly organized folders resting behind the driver's seat, each containing housing assistance paperwork for struggling families. He overlooked the volunteer identification badge clipped inside her purse, the community center parking pass on her dashboard, and the handwritten thank you cards tucked beside the children's drawings in the back seat. His attention remained fixed on proving his first impression correct. The growing audience around them only reinforced his confidence. He believed people expected him to take complete control of the situation, and he intended to do exactly that. The polished leather of his duty boots clicked softly against the pavement as he circled toward the driver's side door of the sport utility vehicle. The afternoon sunlight reflected across his mirrored sunglasses, hiding his eyes from everyone watching. Naomi observed him quietly without taking a single unnecessary step. She recognized the posture immediately. During years of working with vulnerable families, she had met many people who confused certainty with truth. They rarely paused long enough to question themselves, because questioning felt too much like weakness. She had also learned that arguing with someone determined to misunderstand you almost never produced understanding. Across the parking lot, more people gradually stopped to watch. A delivery driver remained beside his van, with the rear door still open. A mother pushing a stroller slowed almost to a stop before gently guiding her toddler behind her. Even the cashier collecting shopping carts glanced repeatedly toward the unusual gathering, sensing that something important was unfolding without fully understanding why. The atmosphere had changed. It no longer felt like an ordinary police interaction. It felt like dozens of strangers had become silent witnesses to a test of character whose outcome none of them could predict. Brooks finally stopped beside Naomi's vehicle and glanced through the side window. His reflection stared back at him beside the colorful drawings taped inside the rear passenger glass. One picture showed a smiling woman holding hands with children beneath a bright yellow sun. Another simply read, "Thank you, Miss Naomi," in uneven blue letters surrounded by hand-drawn stars. He looked at them for only a moment before dismissing them as meaningless. Naomi noticed that brief glance. She wondered whether he had ever been thanked by a frightened child simply for making them feel safe. The thought disappeared as quickly as it arrived. She refused to let assumptions about him replace the facts unfolding before her. A soft gust of wind carried dry leaves across the edge of the parking lot, their quiet scraping almost louder than the whispers spreading through the crowd. Somewhere behind the line of spectators, a phone notification chimed. Another camera quietly began recording. Another witness chose to stay instead of walking away. Daniel Brooks remained completely unaware that the confidence filling his every movement was beginning to work against him. He believed the growing number of observers strengthened his authority. In reality, each new pair of eyes made every decision more permanent than the last, preserving details that would soon matter far more than either of them yet realized. Daniel Brooks rested one hand against the edge of Naomi Carter's sport utility vehicle and spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the conversation had already been decided. "Unlock the vehicle," he said. His tone was flat, practiced, and unquestioning. Naomi looked at him for a brief moment before answering with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning. "Officer, I will cooperate with every lawful instruction you give me." There was no sarcasm in her voice, no challenge, only calm. That unexpected calm seemed to unsettle him more than anger ever could. He studied her face as though searching for the reaction he expected but could not find. The afternoon air felt warmer now. Heat shimmered above the rows of parked cars while distant thunderheads gathered along the western horizon, still too far away to interrupt the sunlight pouring across the shopping center. Around them, the crowd had quietly grown. People no longer pretended they were not watching. A grocery employee stood beside a line of shopping carts with both hands resting on the handle. A retired teacher carrying 2 paper bags remained near the crosswalk. A young couple paused beside their sedan without saying a word. Nobody shouted. Nobody interrupted. They simply watched. Brooks glanced toward the spectators before turning back to Naomi. "You seem unusually calm," he remarked. Naomi offered a faint, respectful smile. Staying calm usually helps everyone. Her answer lingered in the silence between them. It was not the response he wanted. He had expected nervous explanations or emotional frustration. Instead, he found patience, and patience left him with nothing obvious to confront. He reached toward the driver's side window, looking briefly inside once more. The repaired teddy bear sewing kit rested neatly beside the passenger seat. Children's books filled a reusable canvas tote on the rear floorboard. Several folders labeled Family Housing Assistance and Youth Outreach were stacked carefully behind the driver's seat. They were ordinary things, but Brooks dismissed them almost instantly. His first assumption remained stronger than every visible fact surrounding him. Naomi noticed his brief glance and quietly folded her hands together again. She knew that evidence rarely changed a person's mind if that person had already decided which story to believe. Still, she refused to match certainty with certainty. Respect cost her nothing. Somewhere behind the growing crowd, another cell phone was raised. A delivery driver adjusted his baseball cap before pressing record. A nearby store security camera rotated slowly above the entrance, sweeping across the parking lot in its steady programmed pattern. Its small lens reflected a flash of sunlight before continuing its silent watch. Naomi lifted her eyes toward Daniel once more. "Officer," she said gently, "I appreciate that you are doing your job. I only ask one thing." He crossed his arms. "What is that?" She spoke slowly enough that every nearby witness could hear each word without strain. "Please leave your body camera recording for the entire interaction. That protects both of us." For the first time, genuine hesitation crossed his face. It lasted only an instant before confidence returned. A thin smile appeared beneath his sunglasses. "Everything I do is by the book," he replied. "Then I am glad it is being documented," Naomi answered softly. The simple sentence drifted through the warm afternoon air like a stone disappearing into still water. Several people exchanged quiet glances. The retired teacher nodded almost imperceptibly. The young father lowered his eyes for a moment before looking back again. Brooks adjusted the small camera mounted to the center of his uniform, almost unconsciously confirming that it remained active. He believed the gesture demonstrated authority. Instead, it quietly reassured every witness standing nearby. Naomi said nothing more. She simply waited. The breeze carried the faint scent of approaching rain across the parking lot, stirring the children's drawings taped inside the rear window just enough to make one corner flutter against the glass. Time seemed to slow once again. Every ordinary sound, the rolling shopping carts, the distant traffic, the chirping birds perched on the light poles, faded beneath the weight of anticipation. None of the people standing there could know that the smallest decision made during the next few moments would eventually matter far more than the loudest words spoken that afternoon. Daniel Brooks drew a slow breath before speaking again, his voice carrying just loudly enough for the circle of onlookers to hear every word. "Since you insist on cooperating, then this should be simple." He motioned toward the sport utility vehicle. "Unlock the doors." Naomi reached carefully into her purse only after he nodded his approval, retrieved the key fob, and unlocked the vehicle with a quiet electronic click. She immediately stepped back, leaving several feet of space between herself and the driver's door. Every movement remained deliberate, measured, and impossible to misunderstand. Brooks opened the door and began looking through the interior with growing determination, convinced that if he searched long enough he would eventually justify the assumptions he had made from the very beginning. The shopping bags remained neatly arranged. The children's books stayed stacked in careful order. The housing assistance folders rested exactly where Naomi had left them. He lifted one folder, just enough to glance at the cover before placing it back without reading it. His attention drifted toward the passenger seat, where the small sewing kit lay beside the carefully repaired teddy bear. "What is this?" he asked. Naomi answered quietly. "A little boy asked me to fix his favorite bear before I bring it back tomorrow." Brooks looked at the toy for only a second before setting it aside. He continued searching, opening the center console and glancing into the storage compartments. Every passing moment made the silence among the witnesses heavier. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, only the growing contrast between one person searching for proof of suspicion and another standing patiently with nothing to hide. A light breeze swept across the parking lot again, carrying the scent of rain as gray clouds slowly gathered beyond the distant tree line. Somewhere overhead, a flock of birds changed direction together, their shadows briefly crossing the pavement. Naomi folded her hands once more and quietly waited. She never interrupted. She never demanded explanations. She simply allowed the truth to remain exactly where it had always been. Nearby, the retired teacher adjusted her glasses and whispered something to the young father standing beside her. He nodded without taking his eyes off the scene. Another shopper slowly lowered a grocery bag to the ground, so both hands could hold a phone recording steadily. The parking lot had become strangely quiet despite the dozens of people moving through it. Even passing drivers slowed as they noticed the unusual gathering. Brooks finally stepped back from the vehicle. His expression revealed a hint of frustration he could no longer disguise. Everything inside reflected the life of someone devoted to serving others rather than herself. Volunteer paperwork, children's drawings, community resource guides, family photographs tucked neatly into the visor. Nothing matched the picture he had confidently imagined only minutes earlier. Still, instead of reconsidering, he doubled down on certainty. "Where have you been today?" he asked sharply. Naomi answered without hesitation. "At the East Charlotte Family Resource Center until about 1:30 this afternoon. After that, I stopped at a fabric store to buy thread for the teddy bear. Then I came here for groceries." "Can anyone verify that?" Brooks asked. "Yes, sir. My coworkers can. Several families were there as well." Before he could respond, a gentle voice rose from behind the crowd. "Officer, I can verify it." Heads turned almost in unison. A middle-aged woman wearing a blue volunteer shirt stepped forward slowly, still holding a paper grocery sack against her hip. Recognition immediately softened Naomi's eyes. "Mrs. Alvarez," she said quietly. The woman nodded. "Naomi spent half the day helping my granddaughter after the apartment fire. She was with us." Brooks looked from the volunteer to Naomi, then toward the growing circle of witnesses. No one spoke. No one celebrated. They simply watched as another piece of the afternoon quietly settled into place. High above them, the small camera attached to his uniform continued recording every word, every pause, and every expression without choosing sides, preserving the truth with silent precision while dark clouds edged closer across the Carolina sky. The parking lot settled into a silence so complete that even the distant traffic seemed to fade beneath it. No one hurried to speak. No one rushed to fill the empty space hanging between Naomi Carter and Officer Daniel Brooks. The wind arrived first, cool and gentle, carrying the unmistakable scent of approaching rain across the rows of parked cars. It stirred the loose corners of the children's drawings taped inside Naomi's rear window, making them flutter softly against the glass like quiet reminders of lives she had touched long before this afternoon began. Brooks remained motionless beside the open driver's door, one hand resting against the frame as though he needed something solid to steady the certainty that had begun slipping away. The confidence that had shaped every word he spoke only minutes earlier now felt strangely heavier, weighed down by ordinary facts that refused to disappear. The volunteer's calm testimony still echoed in the minds of everyone standing nearby. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. Truth rarely arrived with noise. It simply stood where it had always been, waiting for someone willing to notice it. Naomi drew one slow breath, feeling the cooler air settle across her face. She did not smile. She did not look triumphant. She understood that moments like this were never victories over another person. They were opportunities for someone to choose a different path. Years of counseling frightened families had taught her that shame often caused people to cling even tighter to their mistakes. Compassion, however, sometimes opened doors that force never could. She quietly looked toward the gathering clouds stretching across the Carolina sky. Thin rays of afternoon sunlight slipped between them, washing the parking lot in a softer light that seemed to drain the sharp edges from everything around her. A small boy standing beside his mother squeezed her hand and whispered something too quiet for anyone else to hear. She gently brushed his hair away from his forehead before nodding without taking her eyes off the unfolding scene. The retired teacher slowly lowered her phone, but did not leave. The grocery employee stopped pretending to organize shopping carts and simply stood still. Even the birds perched along the light poles had grown quiet, as though the entire afternoon had paused to witness what would happen next. Brooks glanced almost unconsciously toward the small camera attached to the center of his uniform. Its tiny indicator light continued blinking steadily, indifferent to rank, emotion, or opinion. It had recorded every instruction, every pause, every question, every answer. Nearby, the security camera mounted above the grocery store entrance completed another slow sweep across the parking lot before beginning the same silent pattern again. Naomi noticed both cameras without saying a word. She had asked for nothing extraordinary, only that the truth be allowed to remain visible. A few light raindrops finally touched the warm pavement, each one leaving a dark circle that quickly disappeared into the concrete. The first drops landed on Brooks's polished boots, then on the hood of Naomi's vehicle, creating a quiet rhythm almost delicate enough to be mistaken for distant applause. No one moved toward shelter. The crowd remained exactly where it was. Some moments asked people to stay. This was one of them. Naomi gently folded her hands once more and looked directly at the officer before speaking in the same calm voice that had never once risen above ordinary conversation. "Officer, I know today has been difficult for both of us. I only hope that when this is over, everyone walks away with the truth." Her words carried no accusation, no bitterness, only quiet hope. Brooks did not answer immediately. The rain continued falling, light enough to cool the air without emptying the parking lot. The badge on his chest reflected a faint glimmer of silver beneath the darkening sky, while the blinking light on his body camera continued recording in complete silence, preserving a story that had not yet reached its ending but had already become impossible to erase. The silence inside the executive conference room no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to truth. The chief legal officer slowly removed his reading glasses and placed them beside the thick merger binder before looking directly at Jackson Hale. His voice was steady, but everyone could hear the weight behind every word. "Sir, every concern that young woman raised has now been verified." Nobody reached for a response. Nobody attempted another explanation. The polished table that had reflected confidence only minutes earlier now reflected something entirely different. Regret. Jackson lowered his eyes toward the unsigned signature page resting in front of him. The expensive fountain pen remained exactly where he had left it. A single stroke of ink would have committed his company to years of legal exposure that none of his executives had recognized. He turned another page slowly, reading each paragraph with fresh eyes. Suddenly the language looked different. The complicated legal terminology that had seemed routine now revealed a careful pattern of shifted responsibility. Every sentence Maya had spoken returned to him with uncomfortable clarity. She had not guessed. She had understood. Across the room, one of the senior attorneys quietly accessed the firm's secure revision history. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard before stopping altogether. He inhaled sharply. Every head turned toward him. The document was modified. "At 12:43 this morning," he said. The liability clause was replaced after the final internal review. A murmur spread across the conference table before disappearing almost immediately. Jackson slowly lifted his eyes toward Derek Vaughn. The polished confidence that had defined Derek throughout the meeting had begun to fade. His smile looked forced now. His shoulders seemed tighter inside his tailored suit. "There must be some administrative misunderstanding," Derek said carefully. "Late revisions happen in transactions of this size." The outside counsel answered before Jackson could speak. "Administrative revisions do not remove reciprocal protection from one party while transferring nearly every foreseeable obligation to the other." Another attorney nodded quietly. If this agreement had been executed exactly as written, Hale Investments would have assumed virtually unlimited post-merger liability, while Vaughn Global retained significant protection. The words settled over the room like heavy winter snow. Nobody argued. Nobody defended the language anymore. Clara Hale looked toward the empty doorway where Maya had disappeared less than an hour earlier. The memory made her chest tighten. She remembered dismissing the teenager without giving her a chance to finish. She remembered believing experience always wore expensive suits. Now she realized wisdom had entered the room, wearing a visitor badge and borrowed sneakers. Jackson finally stood from his chair. He did not raise his voice because he no longer needed to. Every person at the table watched him in complete silence. He walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Afternoon sunlight reflected across the glass towers outside, but he barely noticed the city beneath him. His thoughts remained downstairs in the quiet security office where Maya and her mother were probably still waiting without knowing whether honesty had cost them everything. Behind him, the chief legal officer spoke once more. Sir, had she remained silent for another 60 seconds, this company would have signed away protections worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Jackson closed his eyes. Briefly, the number itself mattered less than the realization that everyone with authority had overlooked what one young woman without authority had immediately recognized. He turned back toward the table. Cancel today's signing, he said calmly. Suspend every discussion until a complete forensic review is finished. No one objected. No one even hesitated. Assistants immediately began collecting documents while attorneys secured electronic records for independent examination. Derek Vaughn remained seated for several long seconds before slowly gathering his briefcase. His movements lacked the confidence he had carried into the meeting. He understood what everyone else now understood. The room had witnessed something far greater than a contract dispute. It had witnessed integrity exposing deception without shouting, without status, and without fear. Jackson watched the conference room empty one executive at a time before speaking one final sentence to his chief of staff. Before anyone leaves this building, find Maya Williams. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. She deserves to hear the truth before anyone else does. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime, but Maya and her mother remained seated inside the security office exactly as they had been for most of the afternoon. Denise folded her hands tightly in her lap, while Maya stared through the glass wall toward the marble lobby where employees continued walking past without looking inside. Every passing minute made the waiting feel heavier. Neither of them knew that 27 floors above, an entire billion-dollar transaction had collapsed because one young woman had refused to ignore what she knew was wrong. A sudden movement outside the office caught Maya's attention. Four executives stepped out of a private elevator, followed by the chief legal officer, the outside counsel, and finally Jackson Hale himself. The entire lobby seemed to slow. Receptionists stopped typing. Security officers instinctively straightened their posture. Jackson walked without rushing, his expression calm, but noticeably different from the man who had nearly signed the agreement earlier that day. He stopped directly, in front of the security office door, before looking toward the officer inside. Please open it. The electronic lock released with a soft click. Maya immediately stood. Denise rose beside her, preparing herself for the worst. Jackson entered alone. No cameras. No assistants. No attorneys. Just a businessman carrying the weight of a mistake he had almost made. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Jackson looked directly at Maya before extending the unsigned merger agreement toward her. You saved my company. His voice remained steady, but the sincerity behind it filled the room more completely than any speech could have. Maya blinked in surprise. She looked at the thick binder before slowly raising her eyes again. Sir, I only pointed out what I saw. Jackson nodded gently. That is exactly why we are all standing here, instead of explaining to thousands of employees why their future disappeared with one signature. Denise looked from her daughter to the billionaire, struggling to understand what had happened upstairs. The chief legal officer stepped inside carrying another folder. Miss Williams, every statement you made has been independently confirmed. The liability clause had been altered after the final review. Had Mr. Hale signed the agreement, the consequences would have reached every employee across this company. Denise covered her mouth as tears quietly gathered in her eyes. She had spent the entire day believing her daughter had destroyed their future. Instead, she had protected the future of people she would never even meet. Jackson turned toward Denise with genuine respect. Mrs. Williams, I owe both of you an apology. Your daughter demonstrated more integrity than an entire room filled with experienced executives. I judged her by where she stood instead of listening to what she knew. Denise slowly shook her head. She has always spoken up when something felt wrong. Sometimes it made life harder for her. Jackson smiled sadly. Today it made life better for thousands. Maya lowered her eyes for a moment. I never wanted recognition, sir. I just could not watch you sign something that did not seem right. Jackson studied her quietly before asking. A question that surprised everyone in the room. Who taught you to read contracts like that? Maya smiled for the first time all day. My grandfather worked nights cleaning government offices. During the day, he borrowed old business textbooks from the public library. He always told me that knowledge belongs to anyone willing to study it. Jackson looked down thoughtfully. He raised an extraordinary granddaughter. He reached into the folder the chief legal officer had handed him and removed a formal letter printed on company stationery. Miss Williams, effective immediately, I would like to offer you a paid internship with our corporate legal and risk analysis department. Your education will be fully sponsored if you choose to continue it, and when you are ready, there will be a permanent position waiting for you here. The room fell completely silent once again. Maya accepted the envelope with careful hands, almost afraid to crease the paper. She looked toward her mother, whose tears now carried relief instead of fear. After a long pause, Maya looked back at Jackson. Thank you, sir. I accept the opportunity. But there is one condition. Jackson raised an eyebrow with quiet curiosity. My mother keeps her job. She should never have suffered because I chose to tell the truth. Jackson answered without hesitation. She will not only keep her position. Beginning tomorrow, she will supervise the entire evening facilities team. Denise closed her eyes as emotion finally overcame her. Jackson extended his hand toward Maya. This time, when she accepted it, nobody in the lobby saw a billionaire shaking hands with a janitor's daughter. They saw two people standing on equal ground, connected not by status, but by honesty. 1 year later, the revolving doors of Hale Investments opened to the quiet rhythm of another ordinary Monday morning, yet almost everything inside the building had changed. Employees still hurried across the marble lobby carrying coffee cups and laptop bags. Security officers still greeted familiar faces, and sunlight still poured through the towering glass walls overlooking Manhattan. But one detail always caught the attention of new visitors. Mounted beside the reception desk was a simple bronze plaque. It did not celebrate a record-breaking merger or a profitable acquisition. Instead, it carried only one sentence. The courage to speak the truth protects everyone. Few people knew the story behind those words, but everyone who worked in the building understood why they mattered. Maya Williams stepped through the entrance carrying a leather portfolio instead of a visitor badge. Her business attire was professional but modest, unchanged by the opportunities that had entered her life. She still greeted the security officers by name before taking the elevator upstairs. The difference was no longer where she stood. It was where people invited her to stand. The internship had become a permanent position after she completed her first year of college through the educational program Hale Investments funded. Her professors often praised her ability to recognize risks others overlooked, but Maya never described it as talent. She simply remembered her grandfather's words every morning. Read carefully. Listen quietly. Never let fear become louder than truth. On the 27th floor, Jackson Hale stood beside the conference room windows watching the city wake beneath the morning light. Another merger agreement rested on the polished table behind him. This time, however, one chair had been intentionally reserved near the legal department. Maya entered carrying her notes, and Jackson smiled with genuine respect. Good morning, Miss Williams. She returned the smile. Good morning, sir. Around the table, senior executives welcomed her not because of sympathy, but because they trusted her judgment. Status had quietly given way to credibility. Before the meeting officially began, Jackson addressed everyone in the room. There is one tradition we will continue before every major agreement. He looked toward Maya. No signature is more important than asking whether we have missed something. The executives nodded without hesitation. Nobody considered the practice unusual anymore. It had become part of the company's culture. Downstairs, Denise Williams supervised the evening facilities department with the same quiet dignity she had always carried. The title on her office door had changed, but her kindness had not. She still knew every cleaner by name. She still stayed late whenever someone needed help. More than once, she had quietly reminded new employees never to underestimate anyone wearing a maintenance badge because wisdom often arrived dressed in ordinary clothes. Months after the failed merger, investigators confirmed that the altered contract had been deliberately manipulated during the final revision process. Several executives from outside firms faced professional consequences, while Hale Investments strengthened its review procedures across every department. Jackson rarely spoke publicly about that difficult chapter. Whenever reporters asked how his company had avoided one of the largest financial mistakes in its history, he always gave the same answer. Someone with integrity cared more about doing what was right than protecting herself. He never mentioned Maya's background unless she chose to share it herself. She had earned recognition through character, not through headlines. Late one evening, after another successful day at work, Maya paused in the now quiet conference room before turning off the lights. She looked at the same chair where she had once stood trembling as a frightened teenager surrounded by people who doubted her. The room felt different now, not because the furniture had changed or because new contracts filled the shelves. It felt different because respect had replaced assumption. She gently closed the binder on the conference table, switched off the final light, and walked toward the elevator. Behind her, the last rays of sunset reflected across the empty glass walls, filling the room with a warm golden glow before fading into the calm blue of evening. Outside, the city continued moving with its usual urgency, unaware that one quiet decision made by one ordinary young woman had protected thousands of families she would never meet. Some victories never arrive with applause. Some heroes never raise their voices. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is simply the one who chooses to tell the truth when silence would have been easier. And long after every contract had been replaced and every meeting had been forgotten, that truth remained the most valuable investment Hale Investments had ever made.